I grew up on my grandfather's farm, a wide stretch of green that rolled out under the open sky like a painting you could walk into. It wasn't just land, it was history. Every fence post, every weathered barn beam had a story attached to it. My grandfather was the kind of man who woke before the sun and didn't sit down until the last of the chores were done, his boots always caked with dirt, his hands rough but warm. He built that farm with his own 2 hands, and it wasn't just where we lived, it was who we were. As a kid, I spent summers chasing chickens, stacking hay, riding along on the tractor as Grandpa plowed the fields. Even when I moved away for college and later got a job in the city, I'd come back every chance I could. That farm grounded me. It reminded me of who I was before the world got complicated. Grandpa used to tell me, land is the only thing they're not making any more of. You hold on to it. You fight for it if you have to. At the time, I didn't understand just how literal that warning would become. The first sign of trouble came about 2 years before my grandfather passed away. I remember coming home one weekend and seeing some strange men walking the fence line, clipboards in hand. They were measuring, taking pictures, muttering to each other. Grandpa stood on the porch watching them with a glare so sharp it could cut glass. When I asked who they were, he just spat in the dirt and said they were from that damned HOA, a homeowners association that had sprung up after some developers started building a fancy new subdivision about a mile down the road. They think they run the whole valley now, Grandpa grumbled. I didn't think much of it at first. Our farm had been here for over 70 years. Surely no one could tell us what to do with it. But I soon learned that HOAs don't care much about history. They care about power and money. And these folks had both. Over the next few months, the letters started coming. Certified mail, full of legal jargon and demands. They said our barn violated community aesthetic standards. They said our tractors were an eyesore and had to be stored out of sight. They even complained about the smell of the cows, as if they didn't realize they'd built their cookie-cutter homes right next to an active farm. At first, Grandpa ignored them. Then he started writing back, short, angry letters telling them to go to hell. But the HOA didn't back down. They fined him. At first, it was a few $100s. Then a few thousand. Every time we refused to pay, they tacked on more fees, claimed more violations, threatened to take us to court. By the time I moved back to help Grandpa full-time, they were demanding almost $500,000 in back fines and legal costs. It was insane. We didn't have that kind of money. The farm barely made enough to cover the taxes and upkeep as it was. I watched my grandfather age 10 years in those months. He'd sit at the kitchen table staring at the latest stack of papers, his coffee growing cold, his jaw tight. He tried to put on a brave face for me, but I could see the worry in his eyes. This land was his life's work. Losing it would mean losing everything. And yet the HOA seemed determined to grind him down until he gave up. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. They wanted the land, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Sometimes at night, I'd hear Grandpa walking the property line, flashlight in hand, like a soldier guarding a fort. "They're not taking it," he'd mutter to himself. "Not while I'm breathing." But one winter morning, I found him slumped over that same kitchen table, letters spread around him like a funeral wreath. His heart had given out. He was gone, and suddenly the fight for the farm was mine alone. In the weeks after the funeral, I barely had time to grieve. The HOA saw my grandfather's death as their opening move. They hit me with a lawsuit before we'd even buried him, claiming I now owed them over $450,000 in fines and fees. Their lawyer even had the audacity to suggest that if I couldn't pay, I could just sign over the deed and be done with it. I remember standing in that courtroom for the first time, hands clenched into fists, listening to them talk about our farm like it was just some empty lot they could flip. They didn't care about the generations who had worked this soil, about the sweat and blood poured into it. All they cared about was clearing the way for whatever shiny new project they had in mind. It was in that moment that something in me hardened. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore. I was fighting for my grandfather's legacy, for every early morning he'd spent milking cows, every late night he'd spent fixing fences. I walked out of that courthouse with a new resolve. They wanted a fight? They were going to get one, and they had no idea just how far I was willing to go. After Grandpa's funeral, the farm felt different. The air was heavier somehow, like the land itself knew something was missing. I kept doing the chores, kept the animals fed, kept the fields running, but it all felt mechanical. My grandfather had been the heart of this place, and now it was just me and a mountain of problems. The HOA letters kept coming, each one nastier than the last. Threats of foreclosure, liens, court dates. I tried ignoring them, but I quickly learned that ignoring an HOA only makes them hungrier. They showed up in person this time, board members in their pressed polos and smug smiles, standing on my porch like they owned the place. Their president, a sharp-faced woman named Linda, was the worst of them all. She looked at me like I was a stray dog she was about to have hauled off the property. "You need to settle your grandfather's debts," she said in a syrupy voice that didn't match the steel in her eyes. "It would be easier for everyone if you just walked away." I didn't say a word. I just shut the door in her face and watched her storm off down the driveway. But something about the way she said, "Walk away," stuck with me. They weren't just trying to collect fines. They wanted the land. Badly. And that made me wonder, why? Sure, our farm was big, but there was plenty of land in the valley. Why go after us so hard? Why now? That night, I pulled out all the files Grandpa had saved over the years, old deeds, survey maps, tax documents. I spread them out on the kitchen table like a detective working a case. That's when I noticed something strange. The original deed, handwritten and notarized from decades ago, described the property boundaries in exacting detail. But when I compared it to the county's current records online, the boundaries didn't match. According to the county, our farm was about 20 acres smaller than the deed said it should be. 20 acres, gone, just like that. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went down to the county clerk's office and asked to see all the records for our property. The clerk was helpful at first, pulling out file after file, until she saw the discrepancy I was pointing out. Then her smile faltered. She said something about updated zoning maps and easement adjustments, but the more I pressed, the more uncomfortable she looked. Finally, she told me I'd have to take it up with the planning department and practically shoved the papers back at me. That was my first real clue that something bigger was going on. Someone had quietly redrawn the lines, and no one wanted to talk about it. I drove straight from the clerk's office to the edge of our property, to the section that was supposedly no longer ours. It was deep in the back, past the tree line where Grandpa and I used to hunt deer. And what I found there made my blood run cold. The clearing that had once been nothing but grass and scrub was now leveled, graded, and, unbelievably, under construction. Big machines sat idle in the dirt, a half-finished building rising from the ground. A security fence surrounded the site, but there were no signs, no permits posted, nothing to indicate what they were building. I stood there for a long time, gripping the fence, staring at the foundation that was now sitting on what should have been our land. That's when I saw the trucks parked off to the side, with the HOA's logo printed right on the doors. It all clicked into place. They weren't just fining us because of some noise complaint or aesthetic violation. They had been systematically squeezing my grandfather until he either paid up or gave up. And while they were doing that, they had quietly taken a chunk of our land, maybe through some shady zoning deal, maybe through outright fraud, and started building on it. I didn't know what the building was yet, but judging by the size of the foundation and the fancy equipment on site, it was no small project. I drove home with my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. That night, I went through every letter, every notice we'd ever received from the HOA, looking for clues. Hidden among the legal jargon, I found references to community development plans and special assessments for resort amenities. Resort. That was the word they used. My stomach turned. They weren't just after our farm because they didn't like the smell of cows. They were building something big, and they needed us out of the way to finish it. The next few weeks became a blur of investigation. I met with a lawyer, a grizzled old guy named Frank who had spent his career dealing with property disputes. At first, he didn't think we had much of a case. HOAs have a lot of power, he warned me. They write their own rules. But when I showed him the original deed and the photos of the construction site, his eyebrows shot up. "This is illegal," he said flatly. "If they took this land without your grandfather's consent, that's fraud. And if they're using it to profit off some development, that's a whole other can of worms." For the first time since Grandpa died, I felt a flicker of hope. Frank started digging through public records, zoning applications, anything he could find. What he uncovered made my blood boil. 2 years ago, right around the time the HOA started hammering Grandpa with fines, they had petitioned the county to rezone a large section of our land for commercial use. The petition was signed not by my grandfather, but by someone claiming to have power of attorney over him. Except Grandpa never gave anyone that authority. The signature was a forgery, plain and simple. They had stolen our land on paper, and then used their legal muscle to make it official. And now, thanks to that paperwork, they were halfway through building what looked like a luxury lodge, a resort for the very residents who had been trying to push us out. I felt sick, but I also felt something else, a kind of grim determination. This wasn't just about saving the farm anymore. This was about revenge. They thought I'd roll over, take the offer, walk away. But I wasn't going anywhere. I was going to make them regret ever messing with my family. And I wasn't going to do it quietly. The very next morning, I drove back to Frank's office with a folder full of everything I'd gathered, the forged rezoning petition, the deed, the photos of the construction site. Frank didn't waste time. He drafted an injunction that same day and filed it with the county court, demanding that all construction on the disputed land stop immediately until the matter of ownership was resolved. It felt like a small victory when the judge signed off on it, ordering a temporary halt on all work. The HOA board members must have gotten the news within hours, because by that afternoon, I saw trucks pulling out of the site and workers packing up. For the first time in months, the farm was quiet, no engines in the distance, no hammering. Just silence. But I knew this was just the opening move. The HOA wasn't going to back down that easily. Sure enough, a few days later I received a thick envelope from their attorneys, accusing me of harassment and interference with community development plans. They claimed I was costing the neighborhood millions of dollars in potential revenue and warned that they would seek damages if I didn't withdraw my injunction. I read the letter out loud to Frank, who laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "They're bluffing," he said. "They know they're on thin ice. They're trying to scare you." It didn't work. If anything, it only made me more determined. Frank and I began building our case brick by brick. He subpoenaed county records, HOA meeting minutes, and financial statements. What we found was worse than I imagined. The HOA hadn't just forged Grandpa's signature, they had been diverting community funds to pay for the resort construction. Dues collected from homeowners, meant for road repairs, landscaping, and maintenance, were being funneled into this private development project. Frank called it a house of cards waiting to collapse. If we could prove it in court, not only would we get our land back, but the entire HOA board could be held personally liable. At the same time, I started playing my own game outside the courtroom. I knew the board hated bad publicity, so I gave them some. I contacted a local reporter I'd gone to high school with and told her everything. She came out to the farm with a cameraman, and I showed her the construction site, the forged documents, and the letters they'd sent my grandfather. The story aired on the evening news, family fights HOA over stolen land, and by the next morning, my phone was blowing up with calls from neighbors, strangers, even activists who specialized in property rights. Suddenly, I wasn't fighting alone. People started showing up at the farm, offering support. A few of them even admitted they'd been bullied by the HOA too, fined for ridiculous things like the color of their shutters or the length of their grass. The board tried to spin it, of course. They sent out a glossy newsletter claiming the resort was for the benefit of the entire community, and that misinformation was being spread by a disgruntled property owner. But their PR campaign backfired. At the next HOA meeting, dozens of angry homeowners showed up, demanding answers. I stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching as Linda and her cronies squirmed under the pressure. When one of the residents asked why dues had gone up 3 times in 2 years, Linda stammered something about capital improvements, which only made the crowd angrier. By the time the meeting ended, half the room was calling for a vote to dissolve the board entirely. That was when I realized I had a real shot at not just saving the farm, but taking the HOA down completely. Frank filed a second motion, this time not just to reclaim our land, but to freeze the HOA's bank accounts until a full audit could be performed. The judge granted it, and suddenly, the board couldn't pay their contractors, their lawyers, or even their landscapers. The half-finished resort sat there like a skeleton, baking in the sun, a reminder of their greed. But I wasn't done. I went back to the property one night, parked my truck by the fence, and just sat there for a while, staring at what they'd tried to build on our land. It was almost peaceful in a twisted way, seeing it all come to a halt. I thought about Grandpa, about all the nights he'd walked this same ground, worrying about losing it. I whispered to the empty field that we were going to win this fight, not just for us, but for everyone they'd ever bullied. And I meant it. When the case finally went to court, the HOA threw everything they had at us, expensive lawyers, expert witnesses, reams of paperwork. But Frank was relentless. He dismantled their case piece by piece, exposing the forged signature, the illegal rezoning, the misuse of funds. When the judge asked Linda directly if she had authorized the use of community funds for the resort without a member vote, she went pale. By the end of the trial, it was clear we had them cornered. The courthouse was packed the day the verdict was finally read. By now, the case had turned into a local spectacle. News crews were outside, residents from the HOA neighborhood filled the gallery, and even a few farmers from neighboring towns had come to watch. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Frank, my jaw tight but my heart steady. This was it, everything we had fought for, every sleepless night, every piece of evidence we had dug up, it all came down to this moment. Linda and the rest of the HOA board sat across from us, looking pale and exhausted. They had been smug at the start of all this, convinced they could crush me with legal fees and endless motions. But after weeks of testimony and documents, their confidence had evaporated. The judge entered, everyone stood, and then we all sat down as she began reading her decision. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles ached. She started by acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the case, noting how rare it was for an HOA dispute to escalate to this level. Then she got to the heart of it, the forged signature. She called it a blatant act of fraud and said the evidence left no doubt whatsoever that my grandfather had never consented to the rezoning of the property. She declared the zoning petition null and void and restored the original property lines to match the deed. My heart nearly burst out of my chest. The land was ours again, officially, legally, beyond question. But she didn't stop there. The judge went on to address the misuse of funds. She ordered a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances, placed the association under court-appointed supervision, and froze the personal assets of the board members until the audit was complete. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Linda's face went sheet white. The judge said that if the audit confirmed our findings, that HOA dues had been diverted to fund the illegal resort, the board members could be personally liable for restitution. Frank gave me a small nod, and I felt a rush of vindication. Not only had we gotten the land back, but they were going to pay for what they'd done. When the hearing adjourned, the reporters swarmed us. I didn't say much, just that I was glad my grandfather's name had been cleared and that the farm would stay in the family where it belonged. Frank did most of the talking, explaining the legal implications of the ruling, but I could tell by the way people were reacting that this case had become bigger than us. It wasn't just about one farm anymore. It was about standing up to overreach, about reminding everyone that property rights still mattered. Back at the farm, I stood at the edge of the field and just breathed it all in. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold, and for the first time in months, I felt a deep sense of peace. The construction site still sat there, silent and abandoned, but now it was no longer a symbol of defeat. It was proof that we had stood our ground and won. I started making plans to tear down what little had been built and return the land to pasture, just like it had been before. But the fight wasn't quite over. The HOA still had to face the consequences of the audit, and that process dragged on for months. When the results finally came back, they were even worse than we imagined. The auditors uncovered hundreds of thousands of dollars in misused funds, not just for the resort project, but for personal expenses, travel, and kickbacks to contractors. The district attorney opened a criminal investigation, and before long, several board members, including Linda, were indicted on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Watching them being led away in handcuffs was surreal. These were the people who had stood on my porch telling me to walk away, who had nearly driven my grandfather into an early grave. Now they were the ones facing judgment. The HOA dissolved shortly after that. The residents voted to disband it entirely and return control of their neighborhood to a voluntary association with no power to levy fines or seize property. Some of those same residents came by the farm to thank me, shaking my hand and saying I had given them their freedom back. I wasn't looking for gratitude, but it felt good to know that what I'd done had helped others too. I kept thinking about Grandpa through it all. I wished he could have seen this, seen justice served, seen the farm safe again. I could almost hear his voice in the wind that swept across the fields, telling me he was proud. I promised him then and there that I would keep the farm running, that I would make sure it thrived for the next generation. This place wasn't just land. It was a legacy. And no one was ever going to take it from us again. The months that followed the court case were some of the busiest of my life, but they were also the most rewarding. The first thing I did was tear down what was left of the resort construction. I rented a backhoe and spent days pulling up concrete, ripping down the unfinished walls, and hauling away debris. Neighbors came to help, some of them people who had voted for the HOA board just a year earlier. We worked together in the hot sun, sweat dripping down our backs, until the land was bare again. When we were done, I stood in the middle of that empty field and felt something inside me shift. This wasn't just a victory anymore, it was a rebirth. The farm had been scarred by their greed, but now it was mine again, completely and absolutely. I poured myself into restoring it. I fixed up the fences, repainted the barn, even planted a new section of pasture where the construction had torn up the soil. Every nail I hammered, every post I set in place felt like a small act of defiance, proof that we had survived. I also started bringing in new livestock, expanding the herd, and even trying some sustainable farming techniques I'd always wanted to experiment with but never had the time or money for. The farm began to thrive again. It was like the land itself had been waiting for this moment, eager to grow, to come back stronger. Word of what had happened spread beyond our small valley. I started getting calls from people in other towns, other states even, who had heard about our fight. They wanted advice on how to stand up to their own HOAs, how to keep from being bullied off their land. I never thought of myself as an activist, but I guess that's what I had become. I even agreed to speak at a couple of local meetings, sharing our story and encouraging others to fight back. Don't let them scare you, I told them. This land is yours. Make them prove every claim, every fine. And if they cross the line, fight like hell. Sometimes I'd walk the farm at night the way Grandpa used to, just me and the stars overhead, listening to the crickets. I'd stop at the fence line and look out over the fields, and it felt like I could still feel his presence there. This land had taken everything from him, his time, his energy, maybe even his health, but it had also given him everything he ever wanted, a life worth living, a family to pass it on to. I finally understood why he had fought so hard to keep it. This place wasn't just dirt and grass. It was memory. It was identity. It was freedom. The old HOA neighborhood eventually transformed too. Without the board constantly breathing down their necks, people started to relax. They painted their houses whatever colors they liked, planted gardens in their front yards, and held block parties in the summer. Some of them would wave when they drove past the farm, and sometimes they'd stop to buy eggs or milk from me. It felt like the wall between them and us had finally come down. One evening, months later, I was sitting on the porch with a cold beer, watching the sun dip below the hills, when I realized I felt truly at peace for the first time since Grandpa passed. The fight had been long, bitter, and exhausting, but it had been worth it. The farm was safe, the people who had tried to destroy it were facing justice, and the future finally felt open again. I thought about what I wanted to do next. Maybe one day I'd build a small guest house on the back lot, invite city kids out to see what farm life was really like. Maybe I'd start a farmer's market, turn this place into more than just a working farm but a place where people could come and connect to the land. But whatever I decided, I knew one thing for sure: this land would stay in our family as long as I had breath in my body. It was no longer just my grandfather's farm. It was mine now, my responsibility, my legacy. And if anyone ever tried to take it again, they'd have to go through me.